It was the height of Prohibition, and a man by the name of Anthony Marino was playing pinochle with his friends late one night in 1932 at a secret speakeasy bar called Marino's. It was also the height of the Great Depression, and all three men lamented their grim monetary prospects and the hard times they were living in. It was then that one of them, Pasqua, an undertaker by trade, made a curious suggestion. What if one of them had a wealthy relative, a sick one at that, with a good insurance policy? Pasqua spoke of the insurance payouts he witnessed in the funeral industry, which remained some of the only sure-thing paydays that had survived in the Depression. This was especially true when the insurance policies included a double indemnity clause. In short, this was an addition to the terms of the policy that stated that when the covered individual dies as a result of an accident, that their payout by the insurance company is necessarily doubled. If only any one of them had an expendable relative that they could make mysteriously disappear, the group of men lamented. Tony Marino surveyed the room and the few lonely after-hours customers still clinging to the bar, and he had a sinister idea. What if they could take one of the vagrants that haunted Marino's bar and invent a relative whom they could then off in some fashion? At that moment, all three men turned their attention to the back of the bar, where an old regular, an Irish drunk named Michael Malloy, was snoring loudly, sleeping off yet another night of unpaid drinks. Michael Malloy was a drifter with an uncertain past, a solitary man of the streets who got by on odd jobs like sweeping the streets or polishing coffins. He was a large and broadly built man. He hailed from Ireland, but none of his acquaintances knew from where exactly, nor if he had any friends or relatives either abroad or in New York City. He took on the occasional bit of work, which he did in exchange for alcohol. He seemed to be about 60 years old, give or take, though years of hard living and drinking had taken their toll, making his exact age hard to pinpoint. The Daily Mirror would later write of Malloy that he was, quote, a part of the flotsam and jetsam in the swift current of underworld speakeasy life, those no longer responsible derelicts who stumble through the last days of their lives in a continual haze of Bowery smoke. This referred to a neighborhood in Lower Manhattan, which from the late 1800s onwards was a haven of prostitution and cheap flop houses and dive saloons. Michael Malloy was a regular at Marino's bar, and one of those who often didn't pay his tab. He would stumble into the bar every morning, asking his distinct Irish brogue for, quote, another morning's morning if you don't mind. And Marino would pour him a whiskey, praying that this was the day that the Irish tyrant paid up. Little did the hapless Michael Malloy know that his bill would soon come due, whether he liked it or not. Pasqua, being the most professionally qualified, volunteered to do the legwork for the gang of three schemers. He paid an acquaintance to come with him to the meetings with the insurance agents, so as not to raise suspicions. The acquaintance gave the pseudonym Nicholas Mellery and listed florist as his line of work, which Pasqua's funeral home verified. Over the course of 5 months, Pasqua was able to secure 3 separate life insurance policies on the fictitious Nicholas Mellery's life. All 3 contained the infamous double indemnity clause that the 3 men so desperately coveted. If everything went according to their plan, Marino and Company would net $3,576, roughly $54,000 today, from the death of Michael Malloy, a man who, with no friends or known family, would seemingly not be missed or mourned. Several other petty criminals had been recruited by Marino to aid in the execution of his fiendish plan. These included John McNally, Edward Tenier Smith, Tough Tony Bastone, and Joseph Maglione. The entire crew, who the press would later brand the Murder Trust, met on a cold night in December. Their nefarious plan was officially underway. To Malloy's unsuspecting delight, Marino offered him an open tab, stating that he had been forced to provide the aggressive deal from other competing saloons which had been outperforming him. Malloy had heard all he needed to hear, and merrily downed a shot of whiskey to celebrate his incredible good fortune. Marino immediately appeared at the bar and refilled his glass, a pattern that would continue into the wee hours of the night. Malloy reportedly drank until Marino's arm had grown sore from tilting the bottle. But even at this point, Malloy showed no signs of ill health and no signs of slowing down. In fact, this bout of binge drinking lasted days. At the end of the first night, Malloy slid unsteadily off his bar stool and said he'd be back soon. he returned every day for the next 3 days, and continued to drink at what appeared to the other bar patrons to be an astonishing and death-defying rate. Marino and his accomplices in the murder trust watched on sullenly and impatiently as Malloy continued to drink down his free liquor. Each night that Malloy stumbled out of the bar in a blackout, Marino hoped it would be the last time anyone saw him alive. After all, if Malloy's body would not succumb to the grip of alcohol poisoning, then surely in his state he would slip and hit his head at some point, right? But on the 4th day of their dark experiment, Malloy again walked into the bar in the morning, alive and quite jolly. Marino was furious. He began to contemplate less subtle methods of disposing of Malloy, even shooting him in the head. But Pasqua reminded him that the death had to look accidental. They arrived at a subtler solution. They would replace the whiskey Marino had been serving Malloy with straight wood alcohol, or methanol, a distilled alcohol far more toxic than ethanol and used for industrial and chemical purposes. Drinking even a trace amount of methanol can be lethal to the human body. Marino fully intended to serve Malloy undiluted shots of the poison. Malloy began to down the toxic methanol shots enthusiastically, while everyone in the know in the bar watched on with fixed attention and fascination. But Malloy, several shots in, showed no signs of discomfort or, for that matter, any signs of slowing down. Just as he had on previous nights, he stumbled out of the bar promising he'd be back for more the next day. And just as he had on past nights, he kept his word. To the astonishment of Marino and his cronies, Malloy returned and drank the wood alcohol for days, seemingly immune to its toxic properties. After several nights of this, Malloy's body finally apparently gave in. He fell off his bar stool one night and collapsed. Malloy was finally down. Everyone watched the still, crumpled figure on the floor. Pasqua knelt next to Malloy and checked his pulse. Malloy was still alive, but his breathing was slow and pained. The bar patrons waited for death to come and claim him. Malloy drew a long and raspy breath and then started snoring. He was not dying. He was merely sleeping it off. He awoke several hours later and asked enthusiastically for another drink. Malloy was back on his feet with a vengeance. Angered, disheartened, and completely befuddled by Malloy's unwillingness to die, the murder trust went to work finding more creative methods to take down their white whale. These methods included Pasqua soaking oysters in alcohol for several days before serving them to Malloy to cause acute indigestion, but with zero effect. Murphy let a tin of sardines rot in the sun for several days, then mixed small slivers of sharp metal in with the fish. He spread the deadly mix onto a sandwich and fed it to Malloy, but even this did not work. Malloy simply gobbled down the sandwich and asked for another. And so an emergency meeting of the murder trust was held. Marino had one idea left, and it was the same evil ploy he had used on poor Maybelle Carlson years earlier, the pneumonia trick. He proposed that they soak Malloy after his nightly blackout and leave him in similarly frozen bedding outside. They rounded up the barely conscious Malloy from his seat at the bar, threw him into the backseat of Pasqua's car, and drove him to the nearby Crotona Park, where they left him passed out on a park bench. Not, however, before dumping a few bottles of water onto his head and body for good measure. That would surely kill Malloy. No such luck. The next morning, Marino returned to the bar in a chipper mood, sure he had rid himself of Malloy for good. But as soon as he opened the door, his heart sank. Malloy had somehow woken up in the middle of the night and walked the half a mile back to the bar on foot and persuaded the night manager to let him in, where he fell asleep on Marino's floor. The frustration of the murder trust only grew. A few nights later, the group of would-be killers packed into Green's cab and lay Malloy, who per usual at that time of night was unconscious from drink, across their feet in the car's back seat. Green drove them a few blocks away, where they lugged Malloy out of the car and laid him down in the street. Green revved the cab's engine and prepared to gun it at Malloy's body. But just as Green accelerated, Malloy came to, leapt to his feet, and managed to jump out of the road just in time, avoiding the oncoming car. Malloy, still incapacitated and seemingly unaware of his surroundings, had managed to dodge death yet again, but the killer vehicle turned around and came back at him from the other way, this time at a speed of 50 miles an hour. The car made contact, and Malloy's body bounced off the hood of the car and came crashing violently down onto the ground. The gang had to quickly leave the scene of the crime, but were convinced the perpetually sloshed Malloy was finally dead. However, Malloy came through the door at Marino's only a few days later, covered in bandages but otherwise alive and well. He sat down at the bar in front of an astonished Marino and cheerily ordered a drink. Malloy told Marino about his recollections of the night of his accident, but all he could remember was tasting whiskey, the bright glow of oncoming headlights, and the blackness that followed. The murder trust finally prevailed over the unkillable Michael Malloy on February 21st, 1933, a full 7 months after the group first gathered in a booth at Marino's speakeasy and set out on their first plan to get rid of Malloy. Malloy's body was found in a building on 168th Street, only a few blocks away from Marino's. A rubber tube had been run from a gaslighting fixture into Malloy's mouth, and a towel had been wrapped tightly around Malloy's head. It seems that the group had finally had enough of leaving anything up to chance. However, this appeared like anything but an accidental death. Being an undertaker, Pasqua had a shady colleague, Dr. Frank Manzella, who agreed to file a fake certificate that listed lobar pneumonia as the cause of death. He brought this document to Metropolitan Life Insurance, who paid out $800 of the claim, but when the bogus death certificate was taken to the next 3 insurance companies, all their claims agents insisted on seeing the body. Pasqua tried to cover it up by claiming that the body had already been buried, but suspicions had already been aroused. Stories and rumors began to circulate in the neighborhood outside Marino's bar, and eventually, the Bronx police became involved. An investigation into the death was launched, and their thin paper trail was quickly debunked. City officials exhumed Malloy's body and identified signs of unnatural death, including lethal levels of carbon monoxide still in the body. In the wake of everything, the newspapers had a field day with the mythic story of Michael Malloy and began to apply nicknames that championed his feats of endurance. Mike the Durable, or even more spectacular, the Rasputin of the Bronx. Eventually, 4 of the key members of the murder trust, Anthony Marino, Frank Pasqua, Daniel Kreisberg, and Joseph Murphy, were convicted of first-degree murder. All 4 gang members tried to plead insanity, but without luck. They were ultimately sentenced to death. They were sent to the electric chair at New York State Sing Sing prison and electrocuted in the summer of 1934. At least, in the end, there was some justice for Michael Malloy, the Irish Rasputin. Not to mention, a lot of free drinks.